This past week, I read an editorial by a young Christian, Chinese Christian from Hong Kong. He recalls growing up in an open society where he was free to practice his religion. He describes attending church camps in the summer and the important role that faith has always played in his life from a very young age. But something has been changing in the climate in Hong Kong, he says, and Christians in particular are aware of it. A recent Christian gathering he attended featured a heavy dose of nationalistic songs, propaganda for the president's current policies, and an open endorsement of the government's agenda. He points to increased pressure on underground churches in mainland China, including the forced removal of crosses and the demolition of church buildings in some areas. Christian leaders are often afraid to speak out, given the state's deep suspicion and distrust of religion. This author, a young theology student named Derek Lam, says that he was taught from a young age that all people are created in the image of God, and that life is about loving your neighbor as yourself. And his commitment to his faith has now put him at odds with the policies of his government. Although there is nothing I would rather do than become a pastor and preach the gospel in Hong Kong, he writes, I will never do it if it means making Jesus subservient to Xi Jinping. Instead, I will continue to fight for religious freedom in Hong Kong, even if I have to do it from behind bars. What I ask of you is to keep Hong Kong in your prayers as we seek to find light amid the sea of darkness descending around us. I had a couple of reactions when I read that this week. The first was profound humility. I know some of you have lived in places where simply identifying as a Christian can get you into trouble. That's never been the case for me. I've been privileged to spend my life in contexts where I have been free to go to church, to assemble, to protest if I felt it was necessary. This young person, I'm guessing 20 or 25 years old, knows that he could go to prison for protesting in the name of his faith, and he is very open about his willingness to do just that. I stand in awe of that kind of courage. That was my first reaction. And my second was to think of the passage from Paul's letter to the Romans that we have in front of us this morning. Do not be conformed to this world, he writes. I'm convinced that the sort of stance taken by Derek Lam, controversial, countercultural, bold, fearless, is something of what Paul is talking about in this reading. At its best, the gospel has always inspired this sort of life across cultures and times and situations. The gospel has always given people a different drumbeat to listen for amidst the strident ones sounding around them. It's one of the things that keeps me committed to this faith. Paul could never have imagined this particular situation in Hong Kong, of course, a couple of millennia and half a world away from his writing desk. But he definitely knew something about the danger of the gospel, the way in which it necessarily puts one outside the dominant way of thinking and being in the world, the way it necessarily puts one in opposition to coercive power and to domination. He was writing to Christians in Rome, after all, Christians who were right there beside the emperor's seat of power. And his words for those Christians were bold ones. He never says the word resist, but I would argue it's there right behind his words. Do not be conformed to this world. Do not let this world tell you who you are. There's a lot of talk of resistance these days, as well there should be. There are tyrants out there to be stood up to. There are ways of life that are draining our earth of its resources at an alarming rate. There are prejudices and injustices that need to be named and opposed. This reading from Paul doesn't name those things to be resisted, but I think it does a fine job of pointing to what Christian resistance might look like. And I think the first thing to notice is that it doesn't begin with resistance at all. It doesn't begin with what's wrong. It begins with Christ. We have been reading Romans little by little over the summer, and months ago, way back in chapter 6, we heard Paul's incredible claim that our fate is wrapped up in Christ's. We have been buried with him by baptism into death, Paul says, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. Christ really has made a new way of life possible for you, Paul says. This does not talk about some distant life up in the clouds. You must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ. He means here. He means now. That central claim that our lives are wrapped up in Christ's life is background for what Paul says here in Romans 12. When he tells the Christians that they are not to be conformed to this world, he's telling them to remember that their lives are not simply their own. Your lives are tied to Christ's life. And that means you are going to be a little bit strange. Some of you have heard me quote the author Flannery O'Connor, who once wrote, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you odd." I love that line, and I think it is right on point with what Paul is up to here. If you know the truth that you are claimed and embraced by grace, then you are going to be a little bit out of step with the world around you. You're not going to be conformed to its worship of power, to its anxious justification of self, to its vision of consuming as the greatest goal of human life. You are going to be odd. I think that's the first thing to notice about the sort of resistance that Paul points to here. It does not begin with naming everything that's wrong. It begins with a deep rootedness in Christ, who has claimed us and who holds us in love. It begins with who God says we are. With that foundation in place, Paul paints a picture of Christian resistance as deeply holistic. It's about the mind and it is about the body. Did you notice that? We have this tendency to draw a real sharp distinction between the two, but Paul weaves language about them together here, which is only right when you are talking about life in Christ. Jesus' resistance to the powers of his time was holistic in just this way. Yes, he had radical ideas about inclusion and grace. He taught and debated and preached, but he also put those ideas into practice. He put his body where his mind was, in the busy marketplaces, at the table with sinners, beside those who were sick, among those who were forgotten, finally right in the way of the violence of those in control. Just as you can't pull the mind and the body apart in how Jesus lived, you can't separate them in how we follow his example. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, Paul says in one breath. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, he says in the next. You belong to Christ, so let that change the way you see the world. Let that grace permeate the way you see yourself, and the way you see others, and the way you see our common home, and the way you see what's important and worthy and true. You belong to Christ, so let that change the way you inhabit your own body. Let that grace permeate the way that you live, so you are ready to offer yourself to serve, or to protest, or to speak up, or to help. You've known people like this, haven't you? People who have let the gospel sink so deeply into them, into who they are, that they always seem just a little bit out of step, moving to the beat of a less anxious, more gracious music. Do not be conformed to this world, says Paul. And of course, how could you be if you let the life of Christ take hold of you? If you let it renew your mind, and if you let it inhabit your body, how can you be conformed to this world? How can you be anything but transformed? I think of Derek Lam in Hong Kong, his roots deep in the gospel, committed to this alternate vision of faith and religious freedom, ready to put his body where his mind is, to stand up and resist in the name of Christ. It may not look just the same for you, But friends, make no mistake. The gospel claims us through and through. And that's how we resist the powers that need resisting, with all that we are, body, mind, and spirit. Amen.